Welcome to Simpler Bible, a daily journey to biblical understanding. Today, we are going to deal with Saul's death and David kind of beginning to come to power as king. Remember, David was anointed as king back in 1 Samuel 16. David, at that point, the Spirit of God was on David. It came off of Saul. A harmful spirit from the Lord was on Saul. David was brought into Saul's house and palace to play music for King Saul. Then David defeated Goliath, and then David became the bodyguard, the chief bodyguard of Saul, and then David was the one leading the battles for Saul. So this has been kind of a long time coming, all right? And so pick up with me in 1 Samuel 31. We have Saul going to war with the Philistines, and we know already from chapter 28 that we saw yesterday that Samuel has said, tomorrow you and your boys are going to be with me in the grave. So 1 Samuel 31:1. Now the Philistines fought against Israel, and the men of Israel fled before the Philistines and fell slain on Mount Gilboa. And the Philistines overtook Saul and his son, and the Philistines struck down Jonathan and Abinadab and Malchishua, the sons of Saul. The battle pressed hard against Saul, and the archers found him, and he was badly wounded by the archers. Then Saul said to his armor-bearer, "Draw your sword and thrust me through with it, lest these uncircumcised men come and thrust me through and mistreat me." But his armor-bearer would not, for he feared greatly. Therefore Saul took his own sword and fell upon it. Now when his armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he also fell upon his sword and died with him. Thus Saul died, and his 3 sons, and his armor-bearer, and all of his men on the same day together. When the men of Israel who were on the other side of the valley and those beyond the Jordan saw that the men of Israel had fled, and that Saul and his sons were dead, they abandoned their cities and fled, and the Philistines came and lived in them. All right, so that doesn't all happen on a Tuesday afternoon. It's like, that's what's going to happen. They see that the Israelites have been destroyed, so they begin to dissipate from their cities, and the Philistines will come in and take over these cities, which has been happening already for decades, right? The next day, the Philistines came to strip the slain, and they found Saul and his 3 sons fallen on Mount Gilboa. And they cut off his head and stripped off his armor, and they sent messengers throughout the land of the Philistines to carry the good news to the house of their idols. That's interesting always to me, to carry the news to the house of their idols and to the people. And they put his armor in the temple of Ashtaroth, and they fastened his body to the wall at Beth-shan. But when the inhabitants of Jabesh-Gilead heard what the Philistines had done to Saul, all the valiant men arose and went all night and took the body of Saul and the bodies of his son from the wall of Beth-shan, and they came to Jabesh and burned them there, and they took their bones and buried them under the tamarisk tree in Jabesh, and they fasted 7 days. Now, I want to remind you of who Jabesh-Gilead is. If you'll remember back in Judges chapter 19 through 21, that's where the man's concubine was raped and murdered by the Benjamites in Gibeah, remember, which is where Saul is from. And remember that he took her body and he divided it into 12 portions and sent it throughout the 12 tribes. And then the people gathered together and they destroyed Benjamin. They destroyed all but 600 men of Benjamin. And there were no wives for the people of Benjamin, these 600 men. All the rest of the Benjamites are dead. And so there were no wives for them. And so Jabesh-Gilead had refused to go up against Benjamin. And so the Israelites put the people of Jabesh-Gilead to death, except for 400 virgin women. And those were given to the men of Benjamin so that they could continue, so that the tribe wouldn't be wiped out. So the only thing that preserved the tribe of Benjamin was the people, the women of the city of Jabesh-Gilead. And these two people groups sustained each other. The only reason that the tribe of Benjamin still exists down to this day, the only reason that the people of Jabesh-Gilead exist to this day is because of the marriage, literal marriage between the Benjamite men and these Jabesh-Gilead women. Now, when Saul first becomes king, the people of Jabesh-Gilead, this is back in like 1 Samuel 10 and 11, when the people of Jabesh-Gilead are being attacked, they send to Saul and they ask for help. They send messengers throughout saying, "Help us." Saul hears of it, takes his own oxen, cuts it up into 12 pieces, because why? That's part of the Benjamite Jabesh-Gilead history. And he cuts up his ox into 12 pieces, sends that throughout Israel, says, "Everyone gather together and let's go defend Jabesh-Gilead." And so we see that Saul, a Benjamite of Gibeah, goes and defends Jabesh-Gilead. So the people of Jabesh-Gilead had spared essentially the people of Benjamin, and now the people of Benjamin had spared. So there's this relationship between these two people groups that is carried throughout the pages of our Bible. And it's something that we kind of miss because it's been a while since we've talked about Jabesh-Gilead. And if you're just reading through the Bible one chapter at a time, we forget about it. And it hadn't even been that many weeks since we talked about it, or many days since we talked about it, and we probably have forgotten about it already. So the Philistines behead Saul. They take the bodies of Saul and his sons. They nail them to the wall in front of all these Philistine people to kind of be looked at and mocked at. And the people of Jabesh-Gilead hear about it. And they go and they by night bring these bodies off the wall. They bring them back home. They burn the bodies. This isn't desecrating them. They burn the bodies, and they take the bones of these bodies and they bury the bones of Saul and his sons, because the people of Jabesh-Gilead are caring for their Benjamite king. Okay, this won't be the last time we hear of that either. So I'll remind you of that. We'll see a little bit of it here in the next chapter, in fact. So look at 2 Samuel chapter 1. After the death of Saul, now listen, after the death of Saul, this is our timeline, when David had returned from striking down the Amalekites. That's what we ended on yesterday. David remained 2 days in Ziklag. So here's the story. Saul goes to battle, and he dies in battle. And when he's dying in battle, David is pursuing the Amalekites and defeating the Amalekites. David makes it back home, and he's been home for 2 days. And then on the third day, he's going to get the news that Saul's dead. So Saul's been dead for a few days, because we'll see that the people of Jabesh-Gilead have already gone and rescued the body and brought that back home. So all of that has happened, but it's all less than a week. So look at 2 Samuel 1, verse 2. On the third day, behold, a man from Saul's camp came with his clothes torn and dirt on his head. And he came to David, and he fell to the ground, and he paid homage. And David said, "Where do you come from?" And he said, "I have escaped from the camp of Israel." And David said, "How did it go? Tell me." And he answered, "The people fled from battle, and also many other people have fallen and are dead, and Saul and his son Jonathan are also dead." And David said to the young man who told him, "How do you know that Saul his son and his son Jonathan are dead?" And the young man told him, "By chance I happened to be on Mount Gilboa, and there was Saul leaning on his spear, and behold, the chariots and the horsemen were close upon him." All right, so several things, right? Saul's leaning upon his spear. We know that Saul fell upon his own sword. Several things to consider here. We know from the previous chapter that Saul was wounded by an archer. He says, "I don't want to be mistreated by these uncircumcised Philistines. Kill me." He says that to his armor bearer. His armor bearer won't do it, so Saul falls upon his sword, okay, to die. This guy happens to be there somewhere in that time frame, somewhere prior to Saul being dead. So probably he's already fallen up on his sword, but it didn't kill him. Whatever. The young man who said this, listen, "I was on Mount Gilboa. I saw him there. The chariots were coming." And then verse 7, "And when he looked behind, he saw me, and he said to me," he called to me, and I answered, "Here I am." And he said, "Who are you?" And I answered him, "I'm an Amalekite." And he said, "Stand beside me and kill me, for anguish has seized me, and yet my life still lingers." So he's not quite dead. So the arrow didn't do Saul in. His own falling upon the sword did not do him in. And now he's calling on this guy. He's like leaning on his spear, which we know he always had with him, right? And he's telling this guy, "Look, you got to kill me." Verse 10, so this guy says, "So I stood beside him and killed him, because I was sure he could not live after he had fallen. And I took the crown that was on his head and the armlet that was on his arm, and I brought them here to my Lord." So this guy, this Amalekite, brings David the crown and the band from Saul's arm. David took hold of his own clothes and tore them. This is a sign of grief, right? So did all of the men who were with him. And they mourned and they wept and they fasted until evening for Saul and for Jonathan his son and for the people of the Lord and the house of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. So get this picture in your head. Guy shows up with a crown and a gold armband, and he gives it to David, and he says, "Look, Saul's dead." And David goes, "How do you know?" Long story short, he goes, "I killed him. He was dying. I knew he was going to die, so I finished him off." And David weeps the rest of the day. And this servant's just, this is awkward to me, because this guy's like just kind of there. What's he doing? I don't know. Is he eating dinner? Is he he's letting David get his emotions out, but the guy is there. And then this is what happens. Verse 13. So after David has wept the whole day, David said to the young man who told him, "Where did you come from?" And he said, "I am the son of a sojourner Amalekite." David said to him, and listen to this, see how familiar this is, "How is it that you were not afraid to put out your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed?" So David called one of the young men and said, "Execute him." And he struck him down so that he died. And David says to him, "Your blood be on your own head, for your mouth has testified against you, saying, I have killed the Lord's anointed." Now, I don't know if I have this completely right, but this has always been an interesting story to me, because picture this in your head. I've said before that the Bible is like cartoon images in my head, but this man comes to David with a crown and an armband, says, "Hey, King Saul is dead." David goes, "How do you know he's dead?" He goes, "Well, he was really badly wounded. I finished him off." And David weeps and weeps and weeps until nightfall. And then he says, "Hey," He goes, you shouldn't have done that. How dare you put out your hand against the Lord's anointed? And he gets one of his guys and he says, kill him. And then he kills the guy. And then David apparently says, as the guy is dying, your blood be on your own head, for your mouth has testified against you, saying you killed the Lord's anointed. And so like, it's just a weird kind of scenario. Like David apparently grieves before he exacts revenge. I don't know. It's just a weird kind of scenario. I've always thought it was very strange. So verse 17 says, David lamented with this lamentation over Saul and Jonathan his son, and he said it should be taught to the people of Judah. Behold, it is written in the book of Jasher. We've seen that once before in Joshua 10:13. Remember, do not fall in love with this idea of the book of the upright or the book of Jasher. The oldest manuscripts that exist that are called the book of Jasher are something like only 800 years old. There aren't any older manuscripts than that. No scholarly people believe that the book of Jasher that exists today is the actual book of Jasher. So anyway, keep that in mind. Verse 19, this is what he says. Your glory, O Israel, is slain on your high places. How the mighty have fallen. Tell it not in Gath and publish it not in the streets of Ashkelon. Remember, these were two cities that belonged to the Jews and then belonged to the Philistines, and belonged to the Jews and belonged to the Philistines. So he says, don't brag about this in Gath, don't brag about it in Ashkelon, lest the daughters of the Philistines rejoice, lest the daughters of the uncircumcised exult. You mountains of Gilboa, let there be no dew or rain upon you, nor fields or offerings, for there the shield of the mighty was defiled, the shield of Saul not anointed with oil. From the blood of the slain, from the fat of the mighty, the bow of Jonathan has not turned back, the sword of Saul returned not empty. Saul and Jonathan, beloved and lovely, in life and in death they were not divided. Father and son, right? They were swifter than eagles, they were stronger than lions. You daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you luxuriously in scarlet, who put ornaments of gold on your apparel. How the mighty have fallen in the midst of the battle. Jonathan lies slain on your high places. I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. Very pleasant have you been to me. Your love to me was extraordinary, surpassing the love of women. How the mighty have fallen and the weapons of war have perished. And so this is David weeping over the loss of the king. Remember, when he had been given two earlier opportunities to put Saul to death, he didn't do it because he said, how can I lift up my hand against the Lord's anointed? At that point, remember, David already knew that God had anointed him to be the next king, but David was not trying to manipulate the circumstances or the situations to advance him being the king. David knew that God had anointed him to be the next king. David was not trying to take the throne. David was waiting for God to provide for him the throne, and he was not willing to put his hand against Saul. Remember what he said about Saul when Saul was in the deep sleep and they stole the spear and the water from next to his head, and then he called out to Saul, and David said to his men, he goes, maybe he'll die in battle, or maybe he'll die of old age, or maybe the Lord will strike him with a plague. But he goes, let God deal with Saul. And so God has, in fact, dealt with Saul, and Saul is dead, and the people of Israel are scattered, and the Philistines are still wrecking shop. So you might not remember this from the book of Judges, but the book of Judges ends realistically in chapter 16. And it ends with the story of Samson, who is bringing judgment on the Philistines. And then Samuel is bringing judgment on the Philistines. And then Saul is bringing judgment on the Philistines. And now David will bring judgment on the Philistines. The Philistines were kind of the last big problem that the people had in the book of Judges. And the Philistines will be the problem that the people of Israel face for quite a while yet. But join me tomorrow as we will be in 2 Samuel 2 and 3. And we will see now these things beginning to turn to David, the king. Let me say it this way, because tomorrow's kind of a lengthy one. So let me go ahead and say this now. Saul was the king that the people wanted. Remember back in 1 Samuel 8, the people said, give us a king so that we can be like all the other peoples of the earth. Give us a king so that we can have someone who will go out before us and come in before us. Give us a king. And they rejected God as king. Saul was the king that the people chose. David is the king that God chose, right? He's the second. Remember, it wasn't Ishmael that the blessing came through. It was Isaac. It wasn't Esau that the blessing came through. It was Jacob. It wasn't the first time Joseph revealed himself to his brothers. It was the second. It wasn't the first time that Moses was known to be the deliverer. It was the second time. It's not Adam, like Adam brought about sin. It was the second Adam, Christ, who brings about life, as we see in 1 Corinthians 15. So this now, the second king, is the king that God has chosen. And it is the king who will be the foreshadowing and the image of of Christ. And you might not know this, we'll get to it eventually in the book of Ezekiel, but in the book of Ezekiel, 500 years after David, Ezekiel is talking about, 400 years after David or so, Ezekiel is talking about there will come a king, King David, who will sit on the throne. And so that's a reference to Christ. It's not a reference to the resurrected David. It's a reference to Jesus. And so David's kingship is a picture of the kingship of Christ. And man, there are some really cool things in here that I can't wait to show you. But the first king, the king that the people wanted, has been done away with. And now it's time for the reign of the king that God chose. And you're wondering, where's all the theology been? Look, in Samuel and Kings and Chronicles, as we deal with the kings, it's not a lot of theology because it's kind of a really narrow look at this narrative where what we go back to is 1 Samuel 8. The people have rejected God as king. And now this is what's unfolding as they've rejected God as king. And so that's kind of where we are in the narrative. But I will see you tomorrow, 2 Samuel 2 and 3. Have a great day. Thank you so much for journeying with us today at Simpler Bible through another section of Scripture where we come to know and understand God a little bit better. Look, if you're brand new to Simpler Bible, we have all sorts of resources available for you. Go to our website, simplerbible.com, and there you can find these videos, you can find our podcast, you can find links to our social media, and you can even find a blog post with additional scriptures if you want to go into a little bit more study than we had time to cover in this podcast and video today. We hope that this tool will be exactly that for you, a tool. Not something that replaces your daily walk with God, but something that enhances your daily walk with God and helps you to know and enjoy Him more. Thank you so much for being part of this, and we'll see you again tomorrow.